The snow beneath their boots had already turned black before most of them ever saw a battlefield. Long before the machine guns of World War I tore Europe apart, before the trenches, before the tanks, before the endless barbed wire and poison gas, another generation of young men marched into a nightmare they barely understood. They left their homes believing they were entering an age of glory, honor, and heroic conquest. Painters would later immortalize them beneath golden sunlight, standing proudly beside fluttering flags and magnificent horses as emperors pointed dramatically toward victory. But hidden inside forgotten diaries buried for nearly 2 centuries is a completely different story. A story of freezing marches stretching for hundreds of miles through endless mud and snow. A story of men collapsing from hunger before hearing a single shot fired. A story of entire roads lined not with triumph, but with abandoned wagons, dead horses, shattered boots, and soldiers too exhausted to keep walking. One French officer wrote that by the second week of the campaign, the smell of sickness followed the army like a moving cloud. Another described watching teenage recruits silently stare at campfires with hollow eyes after only days on the road, already transformed into something older, colder, and unrecognizable. This was not the romantic war history books often portray. This was the beginning of modern mass suffering, and the deeper you go into these forgotten first-hand accounts, the darker the reality becomes. Because the Napoleonic Wars were not simply battles between nations, they became a machine that consumed entire generations of Europeans, from Spain to Russia, from Austria to the frozen roads outside Moscow. Millions marched beneath imperial banners, but very few understood the scale of misery waiting ahead of them. At first, everything still looked magnificent. Crowds gathered in city squares to cheer departing regiments. Brass bands echoed through narrow streets. Young soldiers laughed as they polished buttons and adjusted bright uniforms, convinced they would return home as heroes. Some believed the war would end in weeks. Others dreamed of medals, promotions, and glory beside Napoleon himself, the man many viewed as unstoppable. But war has a way of stripping illusions faster than anything else on earth. Within days, uniforms became soaked with rain and sweat. Food wagons disappeared into chaos. Horses collapsed in the mud. Men slept beside roads and temperatures dropping below freezing, waking to discover friends who never stood up again. One Prussian diary described the silence of the morning march after a night of snow, when exhausted soldiers realized the white fields around them were scattered with frozen bodies no one had the strength to bury. And this was only the beginning. Because the true horror of the Napoleonic Wars was not hidden in grand battle paintings or triumphant speeches. It lived inside the small details most history books barely mention: the smell of wet wool, the sound of coughing inside overcrowded barns, the endless hunger, the fear of winter, the realization that survival itself was becoming uncertain. And as we uncover these forgotten diaries together, the myth of glorious warfare will slowly begin to collapse piece by piece. By the time the army crossed deeper into Central Europe, the cheering crowds were gone. The music had faded behind them weeks earlier, replaced now by the endless sound of boots dragging through mud thick enough to swallow wagon wheels whole. One Bavarian infantryman wrote that the roads no longer looked like roads at all. They looked like rivers of dirt, churned endlessly by thousands of men, horses, cannons, and supply carts stretching farther than the eye could see. Rain fell almost every day. Uniforms never fully dried. Wool coats absorbed water until they felt twice as heavy, and many soldiers began sleeping while still standing in formation because exhaustion had become stronger than discipline itself. At night, the camps smelled of smoke, wet leather, sickness, and unwashed bodies pressed together for warmth. There were never enough tents, never enough blankets, never enough food. Officers promised fresh supplies ahead, but the farther they marched, the thinner the rations became. One French drummer boy later recalled that by the 3rd month, he could no longer remember what it felt like to eat until full. Men fought over stale bread so hard it sometimes had to be rationed under armed supervision. And still the columns kept moving eastward, mile after mile, beneath skies that seemed permanently gray. The horses suffered just as badly. Thousands collapsed from overwork before reaching battle. Soldiers described entire roads lined with animal carcasses, frozen stiff beside broken wagons abandoned in ditches. Without horses, cannons could not move. Without cannons, armies stalled. And when armies stalled, disease spread quickly through overcrowded camps, where clean water barely existed. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, and fever moved silently through the ranks, long before enemy armies appeared. One Austrian officer wrote in his diary that men began disappearing from formations every morning, not because they deserted, but because they simply could not wake up anymore. The strangest part was how quickly suffering became normal. At first, recruits reacted with shock whenever they passed bodies beside the roads. Some crossed themselves, others stopped speaking for hours. But after weeks of marching, many soldiers no longer looked down at all. One Prussian account described young men stepping around frozen corpses while casually discussing dinner as if the mind itself had begun protecting them from reality. That transformation frightened veterans more than the enemy ever did, because the war was changing people before battle even started. The grand armies of Europe looked magnificent from a distance, but up close, they resembled moving populations of starving laborers held together by fear, routine, and momentum. And still, the officers kept pushing forward, because everything depended on speed. Napoleon believed rapid movement could crush larger coalitions before they fully organized, so the marches became faster, longer, and more punishing. Soldiers routinely covered 15 to 20 miles a day, carrying muskets, ammunition, cooking equipment, blankets, and heavy packs that cut deep into their shoulders. Boots wore apart after weeks on rough roads, leaving many men wrapping their feet in cloth or scraps of animal hide just to continue walking. Some diaries even described trails of blood appearing behind marching columns during cold weather campaigns. Yet despite everything, many soldiers still clung to the illusion that the real danger had not arrived yet. They believed the hardships of the road were temporary obstacles before victory. They did not yet understand that the marches themselves were becoming one of the deadliest parts of the entire war. The first cannon blast did not sound heroic. According to one Saxon officer, it sounded like the sky itself splitting apart somewhere inside the fog ahead. Then came another, then dozens more rolling across the fields like distant thunder until the ground beneath the soldiers began to tremble. Many recruits had imagined battle as neat lines of men exchanging fire beneath fluttering flags, but the reality waiting for them was confusion so thick that some soldiers later admitted they barely understood where the enemy even was. Smoke from black powder drifted across the battlefield almost immediately, swallowing entire formations in a gray haze that smelled of sulfur, mud, and burned fabric. Officers shouted commands that vanished beneath the roar of artillery. Drums pounded somewhere in the distance. Horses screamed. Men stumbled through fields torn apart by cannon fire, while visibility shrank to only a few yards at a time. One French diary described watching entire sections of infantry disappear into smoke, as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. Another soldier recalled seeing soldiers from 3 different nations wandering aimlessly through the haze, unable to tell friend from enemy anymore. The battlefield had become a machine of noise, fear, and exhaustion, and still the artillery continued. Napoleon understood something earlier commanders had not fully grasped. Cannons were no longer just support weapons. They were becoming instruments capable of breaking entire armies psychologically before infantry even collided. Batteries of guns lined ridges and open hillsides, firing again and again into dense formations packed shoulder to shoulder across muddy ground. Veterans wrote that the most terrifying moments were often not the explosions themselves, but the seconds beforehand, when soldiers could hear the strange whistling sound approaching through the smoke. One Austrian recruit described men instinctively lowering their heads while pretending not to be afraid, because fear itself spread faster than enemy fire. Even experienced officers admitted that maintaining order under bombardment had become nearly impossible once panic entered the ranks. And panic came quickly. Drums disappeared beneath the noise. Messengers vanished. Horses pulling ammunition wagons bolted in terror after sudden blasts shook the earth nearby. Units lost formation and wandered into areas already choked with smoke, wounded men, abandoned gear, and shattered equipment. Some soldiers fired blindly because they could not even see beyond the haze surrounding them. Others stood frozen, unable to process the chaos unfolding around them. One Prussian account described a young officer calmly trying to read a map while cannonballs struck the wet ground nearby, only to realize moments later that nearly half the men around him had already fled without orders. But perhaps the strangest detail hidden inside these forgotten diaries was how quickly the human mind adapted to horror. Soldiers who shook uncontrollably during their first bombardment often described feeling strangely numb by the second or third battle. One infantryman admitted that after weeks of fighting, he no longer reacted to cannon fire at all unless it landed extremely close. That emotional exhaustion frightened many veterans more than the battle itself. It was as if the war slowly stripped away ordinary human instincts, one layer at a time. And by the end of the day, when the smoke finally lifted over shattered fields soaked with rain and scattered equipment, many survivors began realizing something deeply unsettling. The real danger of these wars was not simply death. It was the transformation happening inside the people forced to endure them. When the smoke finally drifted away from the battlefield, many soldiers expected relief. Instead, they found silence so heavy it unsettled them more than the fighting itself. One French cavalry officer wrote that after hours of cannon fire and shouting, the sudden quiet felt unnatural, almost frightening, as though the world itself had stopped breathing. Across the fields, broken wagons leaned sideways in the mud beside scattered muskets, torn packs, abandoned drums, and riderless horses wandering aimlessly through the haze. The air smelled of burned powder, wet earth, sweat, and smoke lingering low across the ground beneath a darkening sky. But what haunted survivors most was not the destruction itself. It was the realization that the battlefield no longer looked human. One Prussian diary described seeing rows of soldiers sitting silently beside the road after the fighting ended, staring ahead with blank expressions while rain soaked through their uniforms. Some had lost friends they had marched beside for months. Others simply looked exhausted beyond emotion. A young Austrian recruit admitted that after his first major battle, he could no longer remember entire sections of the day clearly. The sounds, the smoke, the confusion had blurred together until time itself seemed distorted. And he was not alone. Again and again, forgotten diaries describe men struggling to process what they had witnessed. Some could not sleep for days afterward. Others slept instantly from exhaustion, only to wake up disoriented beneath cold rain beside strangers from different regiments. What shocked many soldiers most was the scale. Earlier wars between European powers had often involved smaller professional armies maneuvering carefully across limited campaigns. But these conflicts were becoming something different entirely. Hundreds of thousands of men now collided across enormous distances, while entire regions were stripped bare trying to feed them. Villages disappeared beneath marching columns. Farms were emptied of grain, horses, and livestock within hours of an army arriving. Civilians often fled long before the fighting reached them because they understood what came afterward. One Spanish priest wrote that roads became crowded with refugees carrying children, blankets, and small carts filled with whatever possessions they could save before the armies swept through. Another diary from Central Europe described church bells ringing constantly as wounded soldiers flooded nearby towns faster than local doctors could handle. And still, the campaigns continued, year after year across the continents, with barely enough time between battles for armies to recover. That endless cycle slowly changed the psychology of the soldiers themselves. In the early stages of war, many still spoke about honor, patriotism, and glory around campfires at night. But after repeated campaigns, those conversations faded. Veterans spoke less. They cleaned weapons in silence. They marched automatically when orders came. One officer observed that experienced soldiers rarely celebrated victories anymore because they already understood what victory usually meant. Another march, another battle, another winter campaign waiting somewhere ahead. Some diaries even described moments where soldiers appeared emotionally detached while walking through scenes that once would have horrified them. Not because they had become cruel, but because exhaustion had overwhelmed their ability to react normally. The war had become too large, too constant, too exhausting for the human mind to fully absorb. And somewhere deep inside these endless campaigns, Europe was beginning to cross a dangerous threshold. Warfare was no longer simply a contest between kings and empires. It was becoming an engine capable of consuming entire populations, physically, emotionally, and psychologically, on a scale the continent had never experienced before. The hospitals frightened many soldiers more than the battlefield ever did. Not because they were places of cruelty, but because they revealed how completely the war was overwhelming everyone involved. One French surgeon wrote that after major engagements, the wounded arrived faster than doctors could even examine them. Churches, barns, monasteries, and schools were transformed into emergency hospitals almost overnight. Floors disappeared beneath rows of exhausted men wrapped in mud-soaked uniforms, while orderlies carried buckets of water through crowded hallways thick with smoke from candles and cooking fires. The smell lingered everywhere. Wet wool, alcohol, sweat, infection, damp straw. One Austrian officer described entering a temporary hospital after a battle and hearing hundreds of voices speaking softly at once beneath the sound of rain striking the roof overhead. Some soldiers whispered prayers. Others called for friends who would never answer. Many simply stared upward in complete exhaustion while surgeons moved endlessly from one patient to the next. There was almost never enough time. Napoleonic-era medicine struggled to keep pace with the sheer scale of industrialized warfare beginning to emerge across Europe. Doctors worked with limited tools, little understanding of infection, and almost no effective pain management beyond alcohol or primitive sedatives. During major campaigns, surgeons sometimes operated for 20 hours straight beneath dim candlelight, while exhausted assistants tried desperately to clean instruments between procedures. One British diary described surgeons removing boots from soldiers whose feet had swollen so badly from marching through cold rain that the leather had hardened like stone. Another account from the Russian campaign described doctors collapsing asleep beside operating tables after days without proper rest. Yet, despite everything, many medical staff continued working under impossible conditions because there simply was no alternative. The armies were too large, the battles too frequent, the suffering too widespread. But perhaps the most haunting detail hidden inside these forgotten diaries was the emotional atmosphere surrounding the hospitals themselves. Soldiers arriving from the battlefield often expected relief once they reached medical care. Instead, many entered places filled with exhaustion, confusion, overcrowding, and uncertainty. One Prussian recruit recalled hearing almost no conversation at all inside a field hospital, except for coughing, footsteps, and quiet murmuring in the darkness. He wrote that the silence felt heavier than cannon fire because everyone understood the same terrible truth. No one knew how long the war would continue, and no one believed the suffering was ending anytime soon. Outside the hospitals, the campaigns continued without pause. New columns marched forward while supply wagons rolled endlessly along roads already destroyed by mud and weather. Officers demanded more speed, more endurance, more movement, and every new battle sent another wave of exhausted soldiers flooding into overcrowded towns already struggling to survive under wartime shortages. Civilians often found themselves caring for strangers from foreign armies because local medical systems had completely collapsed beneath the pressure. One German pastor described villages where every house became a temporary shelter for wounded soldiers during the winter months. Families shared bread with men they could barely communicate with, while church bells rang daily for funerals across the countryside. Yet, even in those moments of suffering, fragments of humanity still survived. Some diaries mentioned soldiers sharing blankets with strangers. Others described nurses writing final letters home for dying men too weak to hold pens themselves. Those small acts of kindness stood out precisely because the larger machinery of war had become so cold, so vast, and so relentless that ordinary compassion itself was beginning to feel rare. Then came the winter that survivors would remember for the rest of their lives. Long after the battles blurred together and the names of villages faded from memory, many veterans could still recall the cold with terrifying clarity. One French officer wrote that the freezing air felt almost alive, creeping slowly through layers of wet wool until even breathing became painful. Another soldier described waking before sunrise to discover frost covering the inside of his coat, while snow drifted silently across endless roads crowded with exhausted men moving east through Russia. By then, the campaigns had stretched far beyond what most armies could realistically sustain. Supply lines reached hundreds of miles across ruined roads buried beneath ice and mud. Horses, weakened by months of marching, collapsed daily in the snow. Wagons became stranded. Food disappeared faster than it could arrive. And still, the columns kept moving deeper into a landscape that seemed to grow colder and emptier with every passing week. At first, many soldiers believed the winter would be temporary, another obstacle to overcome before victory. Officers assured them the campaign would soon end, but the weather only worsened. Temperatures plunged far below freezing, while snowstorms erased roads almost overnight. One German diary described soldiers marching through white fields so vast and silent that it felt as though the entire world had frozen solid around them. Fires became difficult to maintain because there was often little dry wood left to burn. Men wrapped blankets around their faces while sleeping shoulder to shoulder beside weak campfires that barely produced enough heat to keep water from freezing. And the hunger grew worse. Rations shrank again as supply wagons vanished into snow-covered roads clogged with abandoned equipment and exhausted animals. Soldiers boiled leather straps. Others searched frozen villages for scraps of grain hidden beneath floorboards or inside empty barns. One officer admitted that discipline began quietly breaking down during the coldest weeks because survival itself was becoming the army's only real objective. Men stopped speaking about glory altogether. They spoke about bread, about warmth, about whether they could survive another night outdoors. The diaries from this period are filled with strange moments of silence, entire units marching without conversation because everyone lacked the energy to talk. Soldiers staring blankly into snowstorms while ice formed on their beards and coats. One cavalryman recalled watching dozens of men standing around a fire in complete silence for nearly an hour, each too exhausted even to move closer for warmth. And everywhere there were signs that the army itself was beginning to unravel beneath the pressure. Cannons had to be abandoned after horses froze or collapsed from exhaustion. Boots split apart after weeks in frozen conditions. Fingers and toes lost feeling entirely. Some men wrapped rags around their feet because proper footwear had disintegrated miles earlier. Others rode inside supply wagons simply because they no longer had the strength to walk. But perhaps the most haunting detail hidden inside these forgotten accounts was how nature itself began replacing the enemy as the greatest threat. Soldiers often wrote far more about snow, wind, starvation, and exhaustion than they did about battle. One French infantryman confessed that after weeks in the Russian winter, he feared the night more than enemy gunfire because darkness meant temperatures would fall even lower before morning. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the great armies that once crossed Europe beneath magnificent imperial banners began transforming into endless columns of starving survivors wandering through a frozen wasteland with no clear end in sight. By the second winter campaign, many soldiers no longer resembled the young recruits who had marched proudly out of Europe's cities beneath bright banners and military music. The transformation had happened slowly at first, hidden beneath exhaustion, hunger, and endless marching. But now it was impossible to ignore. One French captain wrote that when he looked around the campfires at night, he barely recognized the faces staring back at him. Beards covered hollow cheeks. Uniforms hung loose from bodies, weakened by cold and starvation. Eyes appeared distant and unfocused, as if the men were walking through the war half awake. Some no longer reacted when officers shouted orders. Others obeyed automatically without emotion, moving simply because stopping meant freezing. The war had stripped life down to its simplest instincts: warmth, food, shelter, survival. And as conditions worsened, discipline itself began slowly collapsing beneath the pressure. Supply shortages grew catastrophic during the retreat from Russia. Entire convoys vanished in snowstorms or became stranded along frozen roads littered with broken wagons and dead horses. Soldiers scavenged desperately for anything useful. One diary described men cutting pieces of leather from abandoned saddles and boiling them in water simply to quiet their hunger for a few hours. Another account recalled exhausted infantrymen searching empty villages for hidden potatoes beneath frozen dirt floors while civilians watched silently from darkened corners. The line between soldier and refugee was beginning to disappear. Everywhere there was movement, Endless movement westward through snow and ice beneath skies that remained gray for weeks at a time. One German officer described the roads as rivers of humanity flowing backward through winter. Soldiers, civilians, servants, wounded men, officers, camp followers, and starving horses all pressed together through narrow, frozen paths while cold winds swept across the open plains. And inside those endless columns, something darker began happening to the human spirit itself. Men who once shared bread now hid food from one another. Small arguments erupted over blankets, firewood, or places beside campfires. One officer admitted that hunger had become so severe, some soldiers stopped helping exhausted comrades because they feared falling behind themselves. The war was slowly breaking apart the sense of brotherhood that armies depended upon to survive. Yet, what makes these forgotten diaries so haunting is that many soldiers understood exactly what was happening to them while it occurred. One French infantryman wrote that the army no longer marched like an organized military force. It moved like a crowd escaping some invisible catastrophe spreading across the snow behind them. Another soldier confessed that he had stopped thinking about victory entirely because the word itself no longer felt real. Survival had replaced patriotism. Warm soup mattered more than glory. A dry pair of boots mattered more than medals. And still the cold kept coming. Nights became the worst part of all. Temperatures dropped so low that sleep itself became dangerous for exhausted men too weak to stay awake beside fading fires. One Prussian diary described soldiers huddling together silently in abandoned barns while winter winds pushed snow through cracks in the wooden walls. Nobody spoke much anymore. Conversations required energy. Instead, men simply stared into darkness, listening to coughing, distant horses, and the endless sound of wind sweeping across frozen fields outside. And somewhere during those endless nights, many survivors realized something terrifying. The war was no longer only destroying armies, it was slowly erasing the humanity of the people trapped inside it. The retreat no longer looked like an army returning home. According to countless forgotten diaries, it looked like the collapse of an entire world. The roads stretching westward through the snow had become overcrowded beyond imagination, clogged with shattered wagons, starving horses, exhausted soldiers, and civilians fleeing beside them through freezing winds that never seemed to stop. One French officer wrote that from a distance, the retreat resembled a dark river flowing endlessly across the white landscape, mile after mile of silent figures moving through snow beneath a gray sky. There were no victory songs anymore, no polished uniforms, no confident speeches about empire or glory. Those illusions had frozen somewhere far behind them on the endless roads east of Moscow. What remained now were survivors trying desperately to keep moving. The conditions worsened every day. Snowstorms erased roads overnight, forcing entire columns to wander across frozen fields searching for safe crossings and shelter that rarely existed. Bridges collapsed beneath overcrowded traffic. Supply wagons overturned in ice. Horses too weak to continue were abandoned beside the roads, where snow slowly buried them. One German diary described passing dozens of campfires glowing faintly through the darkness, while exhausted men sat motionless around them, too tired even to speak. Another soldier recalled seeing officers marching beside ordinary infantrymen without rank or ceremony anymore, because the hierarchy of the army itself was beginning to disappear beneath shared desperation. Hunger became constant. Men searched frozen villages for scraps of grain or old vegetables hidden beneath snow-covered cellars. Some traded watches, medals, or weapons to civilians in exchange for bread. Others simply wandered through abandoned homes, searching for warmth beside dying fireplaces. One Austrian account described soldiers sleeping inside ruined churches because they provided the only shelter from the wind. The writer admitted that many no longer cared where they slept, as long as there was a roof overhead and a chance to survive the night. Everywhere, there were signs that Europe itself was unraveling beneath the scale of the disaster. Refugees moved west alongside the retreating armies, carrying children, blankets, and small carts piled with whatever possessions they had managed to save. Villages stood half empty after years of marching armies stripped the countryside bare of food, livestock, and supplies. Church bells rang across frozen towns not for victory, but for funerals, warnings, and desperate prayers. One Russian witness described roads where military discipline had almost completely collapsed beneath exhaustion and fear. Soldiers from different nations marched together without formation, barely speaking, faces hidden beneath layers of frost and torn cloth. And still the retreat continued, day after day, week after week. One French infantryman wrote that the strangest part of the retreat was how normal suffering eventually became. Men no longer reacted when another wagon broke apart in the snow, or when exhausted soldiers quietly disappeared during the night. The human mind had adapted to catastrophe because catastrophe had become constant. That emotional numbness frightened survivors deeply once the war ended, because many realized they had slowly stopped feeling shock altogether. They had become too exhausted to process what was happening around them. And somewhere along those frozen roads, beneath collapsing supply lines and endless winter skies, the great imperial armies of Europe ceased to resemble organized military forces at all. They became wandering populations of broken survivors, carrying the remains of a shattered age back toward a continent that would never fully recover from what it had unleashed. Years later, Europe tried to remember the wars differently. Painters filled museums with glorious cavalry charges beneath golden skies. Emperors stood proudly on horseback, surrounded by disciplined formations and fluttering banners, while history books spoke of genius, strategy, and national destiny. Monuments rose across capitals, honoring triumph and sacrifice. Songs were written, medals displayed. The chaos, the hunger, the freezing roads, and the endless exhaustion slowly disappeared behind polished myths of honor and empire. But hidden inside forgotten diaries scattered across archives and private collections, another memory survived, a colder memory. One written not by emperors or politicians, but by ordinary soldiers who spent years marching through mud, smoke, disease, snow, and fear. And what makes those diaries so unsettling is not simply the suffering they describe, it is how modern everything suddenly feels. Long before the trenches of World War I, these men were already witnessing the birth of industrial-scale warfare. Entire populations mobilized across continents. Endless supply crises, psychological exhaustion spreading through massive armies, civilians trapped inside the path of military campaigns, nations feeding generation after generation into conflicts too large for ordinary people to truly comprehend. One French veteran wrote decades later that the war had never fully ended inside his mind. Even after returning home, he still woke before dawn expecting to hear drums, horses, and shouted orders outside his window. Another former officer admitted he could no longer tolerate winter silence because snow reminded him too much of endless roads filled with exhausted men disappearing into white storms. Some survivors never spoke about the campaigns again at all. Others spent years trying to explain what they had witnessed, only to realize civilians preferred stories of glory over stories of suffering. Perhaps that is why so many of these diaries remained forgotten for generations. They shattered the comforting illusion that the wars of the early 19th century were somehow cleaner, nobler, or more civilized than the conflicts that followed. The truth hidden inside those pages is far darker. Europe was already learning how to wage total war long before machine guns and trenches dominated the 20th century. The scale was smaller than the world wars that would come later, but the transformation had already begun. Human beings were becoming numbers inside systems too massive and relentless for individual lives to matter very much. And maybe that is the most disturbing part of all. Because when you read enough of these forgotten accounts, a strange pattern begins to emerge across every campaign and every nation. French, Austrian, Russian, Prussian, British. Different uniforms, different languages, different flags. Yet the diaries often describe the same emotions, the same exhaustion, the same cold, the same hollow silence after battle. It is as though the war slowly stripped away nationality itself until only survival remained. By the end, many soldiers no longer sounded like patriots defending empires. They sounded like ordinary men trapped inside something far larger than themselves, something nobody fully understood how to stop once it began. And standing here now, 2 centuries later, looking back across those frozen roads and smoke-covered battlefields, one question still lingers uneasily in the darkness. If this was already happening before modern industry, before radio, before tanks, before mechanized slaughter truly transformed warfare forever, then what exactly had Europe already become by the time the first cannon fired across those fields so many years ago?